On the night of my daughter's wedding, her new husband raised his glass and laughed. Don't worry, he only fixes pipes. He won't understand the speeches. The room joined in, a wave of chuckles rolling over me, as if my name itself had been reduced to a wrench and a rusted valve. I smiled because that's what was expected, but inside it felt like someone had soldered shame directly to my skin. They had been saying it since I was a boy. My uncles, my neighbors, even the teachers who handed back my drawings with red ink. That's not architecture, that's doodling. You're just good with pipes. Their voices carried the same rhythm of dismissal, steady as a leaking faucet that no one bothered to fix. And over time, their words became heavier than any tool I ever carried. When other children built castles from blocks, I was the one repairing the cracked joints, making sure the walls stood straight. When I looked at a house, I didn't see only the walls. I saw the invisible veins that made it breathe. The pipes, the water lines, the silent systems no one thanked. But they didn't see a builder in me. They saw a handyman, a fixer, a man destined to crawl beneath sinks and patch leaks. I remember once, when I was 13, I came home with a sketch rolled under my arm, an entire school I had designed on lined paper, every hallway mapped, every staircase planned. My mother smiled with pride, but my father barely looked up from his newspaper. Pretty, he said, but remember, you'll earn your bread with a wrench, not a pencil. That night I tore the sketch in half, but the lines still haunted me in dreams. It wasn't just what they said. It was the way they said it, with finality, with the weight of certainty, as if they had already written my future in chalk on the sidewalk, knowing the rain would never wash it away. You just fix pipes. The words dug trenches in me, narrow and cold, leaving little room for the possibility of more. But even in those trenches I built, secretly, quietly, on the back of receipts, on the corners of old newspapers. I drew buildings no one asked for, a museum shaped like a spiral shell, a library where the shelves rose like cathedral arches. None of it mattered to them. To them, I was only the man who would one day unclog their drains. And yet, beneath the laughter, beneath the labels, I carried a truth that refused to die. Pipes don't just fix water. They hold the lifeblood of buildings. And if no one else would see it, I would. I was not just anything. But at that wedding, when they laughed, I lowered my eyes to the tablecloth, because I knew before justice could arrive, I would have to live through years of being invisible. Friends, let me take a short pause. Please write in the comments, where are you listening to this story from? Has anything like this ever happened in your life? Don't forget to subscribe and share this video. That's how you help us grow this channel and bring more stories to life. And now, we continue. The basement was where they sent me when the laughter upstairs grew too loud. While others toasted beneath chandeliers, I was knee-deep in shadows, crouched by rusted valves that hissed like old secrets. The walls were damp, the concrete always breathing a chill, and the single light bulb overhead swung as though it too wanted to escape the darkness. No applause ever reached this place. No one leaned over to thank me. No one even looked down. But here, in the silence, I began to hear something most of them never would. Every pipe told a story. The rattle of an old joint was not just noise. It was the cry of a building struggling to hold itself together. The steady drip against a metal bucket was not an annoyance. It was a clock, reminding me how time wore everything thin. I listened, really listened, until the silence itself began to speak. Houses, schools, factories, they all had lungs, veins, bones. They breathed through the water lines. They whispered through the walls. And in the basement, where no one bothered to look, I learned to understand their language. Sometimes, when I turned a wrench and felt the pressure change, it was like laying a hand on a beating heart. The walls shivered, The air shifted, and I could feel life return to the space above. No one noticed. No one clapped. They kept laughing, kept drinking, kept dismissing me. But I knew the truth. Without these hidden arteries, their shining rooms would collapse into silence. They thought I was fixing pipes. I was holding their world together. The grime stained my hands until the smell of iron and mildew became part of my skin. I would walk home at night with my shirt soaked, my hair heavy with sweat, and still I carried in my pocket scraps of paper covered in lines and shapes no one asked for. While the world dismissed me as a laborer, the basement became my cathedral, my classroom. I drew arches in my mind while I welded joints. I traced foundations in the dust as I crawled along cracked floors. And though the world above would never see it, I was building something greater than myself in those hidden chambers. No child dreams of spending his life hunched over a broken valve. But I had found something down there the world could not strip away. Dignity, even in silence. Creation, even in shadow. I was more than what they named me. The basement taught me that. And as the pipes whispered their secrets in the dark, I began to realize one day, someday, the world would have to hear them too. At night, when the world above me had gone quiet, and the hum of pipes was the only company left, I would sit at the small wooden bench in the corner of the basement and pull out scraps of paper, receipts, torn envelopes, backs of invoices, whatever I could find that still held an inch of space untouched. On them, I drew. Not water lines or fittings, not the blueprints of repairs, but the dreams I carried when no one was watching. Towers that curved like the stem of a flower, halls that opened like lungs to let in light, staircases that rose in spirals meant to carry people not just upward, but outward, into wonder. No one knew. I kept them hidden in a dented metal drawer under my tools, wrenches, pliers, rusted bolts on top, lines of imagination buried beneath the weight of steel and grease. It was my secret heart, and I guarded it fiercely, for I knew the moment anyone saw those papers, they would laugh. They would tell me once again what they had been telling me all my life. You fix pipes, nothing more. And I could not bear to watch my dreams mocked into silence. Sometimes, after long hours of crawling through filth and patching what others had broken, I would unlock that drawer and spread the papers before me. In those lines, I was not a laborer. I was not a shadow in someone else's story. I was a builder, a dreamer, a creator of worlds. The sketches were not precise. They bore smudges of dirt, fingerprints of oil, but to me, they breathed. I could see people walking through the arches, sunlight pouring through the glass, children running across courtyards that existed only in my pencil. The loneliness of that drawer was both a comfort and a curse. It was proof that another version of me lived, a man unseen, unnamed, unacknowledged. And yet it was also a cage. Every time I slid the drawer shut, the clang of metal was like the sound of a door locking, trapping the life I could have lived inside the shadows of my tools. Years passed that way. Dozens of papers accumulated, stacked in uneven piles, curling at the edges with damp and time. Sometimes, when I took them out, I would trace the lines slowly, as if trying to remember who I was before the world told me who I had to be. In those quiet moments, it was as though the buildings themselves whispered to me, promising that they would not vanish completely, that they would wait until the day someone finally saw them. But no one ever did. Not then. Not yet. And so I kept building invisible cities on scraps of paper, hiding them beneath the weight of tools that defined me. A secret cathedral in a locked drawer, waiting for the day it might finally breathe. One winter evening, when the house was quiet and the cold pressed against the windows, I did something I had never dared before. I opened the drawer, brushed away the layer of dust that had settled over my secret, and pulled out a stack of sketches. My hands trembled as I gathered them. papers softened by years, corners curled, smudged with oil and time. For so long they had been mine alone, but that night I thought perhaps I could finally let someone else see. Not the world, not the neighbors, not the men who laughed at me on construction sites. My son. I believed he would understand. He was young, filled with ambition, already studying business, already convinced he would climb higher than I ever could. I thought, foolishly, perhaps, that showing him these designs might bridge the gap between his world and mine. That maybe he would see his father not as a man hunched over broken pipes, but as someone who carried visions greater than the walls that surrounded us. I laid the papers out carefully on the kitchen table, one by one, like offerings. A library where light fell in ribbons through glass ceilings. A museum shaped as if carved by the wind itself. A small chapel, modest, but filled with curves that caught the sun at every hour. My heart raced as I spread them before him, as though I were opening my chest and showing him the hidden pulse inside. He barely glanced at them. A smirk tugged at his lips, the kind of smirk a man gives when he's already decided the value of what he sees. Then he pushed one of the sketches aside with the back of his hand and said, almost casually, almost carelessly, "You're a plumber, Dad, not an architect." The words should not have been new. I had heard them all my life, but from his mouth they cut deeper than any blade. It wasn't the sentence itself that hurt. It was the dismissal in his eyes, the way he turned away before I could answer, as though what I had shown him wasn't even worth a moment more of his time. It was not rejection in words, it was rejection in silence, in the cold shadow cast by my own child. I gathered the sketches back into my hands, slowly, carefully, as though they might shatter. For a moment I wanted to defend them, to explain the lines, to tell him that a man could be more than one thing. But the weight in his look had already sealed the moment. To him I was only what the world had always told me I was, a fixer of leaks, a man with dirty hands, nothing more. That night I slid the drawings back into the drawer, but something had changed. They no longer felt like dreams, they felt like ghosts, and every line seemed to carry the echo of his laughter. I closed the drawer harder than I meant to, the clang of metal loud in the empty kitchen. And for the first time I wondered if perhaps they had been right all along. It is one thing to be dismissed by strangers. It is another to be dismissed by your own blood. And in that moment, the basement, the tools, the life I had built, they all pressed down on me heavier than ever before. They called me to the site in the dead of summer, when the air was thick with dust and the sound of hammers rang like war drums. The building was half finished. Steel beams standing against the sky like bare bones, walls rising without skin, without breath. They didn't invite me to design, to imagine, to give shape to something new. No, they summoned me when the mistakes had already begun to bleed through the concrete. "Fix it," they said. Always the same words. A valve misplaced, a line misdrawn, a system that had looked fine on paper, but now leaked into the very skeleton of the structure. The architects had left their signatures in ink, proud and polished, but their lines had forgotten the weight of water, the flow of pressure, the hidden veins that made a building alive. So it fell to me, to crawl in, to patch, to stitch their broken visions back together, so the facade above would not collapse. I watched them from a distance, young men in clean shirts, rolled sleeves, holding blueprints as if they were scripture. They spoke of theory, of vision, of design, while I stood in the dust with a wrench in my hand. They gestured toward the horizon, as if they had summoned the future itself, but when the ground betrayed them, when their perfect sketches buckled under reality, they looked down to me, not as a peer, not as a mind, but as a pair of hands. The irony burned deeper than the sun overhead. I could see where their drawings had failed before the cracks even showed. I knew how the pipes would rebel, how the weight of water would seek its own path, how the neglected angles would punish them later. I saw the flaws the way others saw daylight, But I kept silent, because that was my role, the man who comes after, the one who repairs, not the one who prevents. Each time I tightened a joint or redirected a line, I felt the quiet insults settle heavier in my chest. I was saving them, again and again, but invisibly. My fixes would be hidden behind walls, buried under plaster, forgotten once the ribbon was cut and the speeches delivered. They would stand tall in photographs, smiling before the cameras, while my work breathed silently beneath their pride. No one would know that the building stood because of me. And yet, I could not walk away. Because when I touched the lines, when I set them right, there was a strange, aching dignity in it. I was not just fixing pipes. I was giving the structure a heartbeat it did not yet know it had. I was rescuing the vision of others who had dismissed me. And in some twisted way, it was both punishment and redemption. But each night, when I returned home, I could not escape the truth. My son's words echoed louder. "You're a plumber, not an architect." The men at the site had confirmed it without speaking. They didn't need to laugh. They proved it with every order, every dismissal, every gesture that reduced me to a tool. The contract was broken long before I arrived. Not the paper one signed with ink, but the unspoken one between a man and the world he serves. I gave it my hands, my back, my knowledge, my silent corrections, and it gave me invisibility in return. And though I kept working, though I kept saving them, something inside me knew. Silence has its limit, and mine was coming. The hall smelled of varnished wood and ambition. Students filled every row, their notebooks open, their eyes shining, as though they were about to receive the secrets of creation itself. I sat in the very back, a shadow among the eager, my work shirt still smelling faintly of copper and damp concrete. I hadn't been invited. I wasn't on any list. I had simply slipped in through the side door, silent, because I had heard whispers that tonight's lecture would be about the proper systems of a living building, and I knew what that meant. It meant my work. I watched as the professor took the stage, confident and composed, holding in his hands diagrams that looked painfully familiar. He unrolled them for the students, drawings of joint systems, adjustments to water pressure pathways, layouts for ventilation that would keep a building from sweating itself into ruin. I recognized them instantly. They were mine. Not stolen outright, but translated, dressed in academic language, stripped of the grease, the dirt, the trial and error in basements where no student had ever set foot. The knowledge had been lifted from men like me, men who had bent their backs in silence and polished into something that gleamed under the sterile lights of a lecture hall. The students scribbled furiously, nodding as though they had been handed truth from a mountaintop. My throat tightened as I listened. The professor spoke of efficiency models, of practical fluid dynamics in architecture, and every phrase was a clean echo of the messy discoveries I had made years before. Late nights with dripping ceilings, endless experiments with pressure gauges, the instinct that grew not from books, but from sweat and failure. I wanted to stand, to tell them the truth, that these ideas had not come from polished halls, but from basements where walls bled and ceilings sagged, that it was not theory but survival that had shaped them. But I stayed seated. And yet it was not silence that hurt the most. It was invisibility. Sitting there among bright faces, I felt like an intruder in a house I had helped build. Every applause the professor received was an echo of what had been denied me for decades. My hands gripped the wooden chair, rough against my calluses, as though holding myself in place was the only way to keep from breaking. When the lecture ended, the students stood and gathered around him, eager for more. I stayed in my seat, small and unmoving, until the room emptied. Only then did I rise, my footsteps heavy against the polished floor. The stage looked almost wholly under the lights, the diagrams still pinned in view. My eyes lingered on them, not with pride, but with a hollow ache. I had given the world something, but it had been passed through so many hands that my name no longer clung to it. As I walked out into the night air, the cold struck me harder than usual. The laughter from the wedding, my son's smirk, the broken contracts, all of it seemed to converge into this single truth. I had given knowledge, but they had erased me. And the cruelest part was that they had done it so cleanly, so thoroughly, that even those who benefited most never realized I had been there at all. I was a guest in my own legacy, a silent man, sitting in the back row, watching others profit from the heartbeat I had given to buildings. And still, I returned home that night and opened the drawer with my sketches. My hands shook as I unfolded them, tracing each line like a man trying to remember his own face. Because deep down, I knew, if the world would not speak my name, then my only hope was to keep drawing, to keep building in secret, until one day, someday, the silence broke. It began with a sound no one else seemed to notice, a faint groan, low and uneasy, like the throat of the building clearing itself before breaking into a cry. I was passing by the site that day, carrying my tools as always, when I heard it. Others walked past without pause, their shoes clicking confidently on the pavement, their voices light with talk of deadlines and lectures, but I stopped. I stood still and listened. The building was speaking, and I understood its language. It had been raised quickly, a proud project of the university, designed on glossy paper and praised as a symbol of progress. They had ignored me when I warned them about the way the pipes pressed against the walls, the pressure that would build in the hidden lines, the quiet rebellion of water against arrogance. Now, months later, the rebellion had begun. A crack spidered across the wall, faint at first, like a scar forming under the skin. Students walked by with notebooks in hand, remarking that it was unfortunate or a cosmetic flaw. Professors explained it away as settling or a minor miscalculation, but I knew better. I had felt these things in my bones long before they were visible. Every pipe, every joint I'd ever touched had taught me this truth. Neglect the foundations and the walls will answer. Water does not forgive. Pressure does not forget. The building was not failing by chance. It was failing because they had refused to listen. I stood in the crowd when the fracture widened. Dust fell like snow, and the laughter quieted. Students gasped, professors whispered, cameras clicked to capture the lesson. They would write papers about this. They would call it a failure in material, a flaw in calculation. They would circle the problem in diagrams and present it as an academic curiosity. And all the while, I stood there with my fists clenched, knowing the truth, that it was not the concrete or the steel that had betrayed them, but their own arrogance. That night, when the building was evacuated and the site roped off, I returned alone. The moonlight fell across the cracked wall, pale and unforgiving. I laid my hand against the fracture and felt the heartbeat beneath it. The structure was sick, but not beyond saving. My tools lay heavy in the bag at my feet, but it wasn't just about tools. It was about listening, something they had never done, but something I could not stop myself from doing. As I traced the crack with my fingers, I thought of the lectures where my words had been erased, the classrooms where my knowledge had been polished clean of my name. And now, in their absence, the truth had surfaced in the ugliest way possible, through collapse. They would never admit it, not openly. To them, this was a mistake. To study, to correct in theory, to analyze behind podiums. But I knew. It was proof that what they dismissed had always mattered. The building trembled again, as though shivering in shame. And I whispered into the night, not in anger but in sorrow, because I could not unhear the voices of the pipes, the warnings in the walls. They had treated me as invisible. But here, in the dust and the cracks, invisibility had become truth carved into stone. I returned when the world was asleep. The campus lay in silence, the lecture halls dark, the courtyards emptied of voices. Only the moon kept watch as I slipped past the barricades, carrying my bag of tools as though it were a chest of forbidden knowledge. The building loomed before me, wounded and ashamed, its cracked wall glowing faintly in the silver light. I stood for a long moment listening. The air was heavy with the sound no one else could hear, the muffled groan of pressure straining inside the pipes, the quiet panic of a structure begging not to fall. I moved slowly, each step echoing on the bare floors. The place smelled of dust and wet cement, a scent I had known all my life, sharp as memory. When I laid my hand against the wall, it was warm. The building was alive, fevered, and I knew exactly where it hurt. I did not need diagrams or calculations. The rhythm of the pipes guided me, the faint vibration beneath my fingertips telling me where the danger lived. I opened the valves one by one, letting the pressure bleed out like a doctor lancing a wound. The hiss of air, the gurgle of water, the settling creak of metal. It was music to me, the kind no one applauded but that I had always understood. I braced failing joints with my own weight, tightened bolts until my hands bled, redirected the flow so the walls could breathe again. There was no blueprint for what I did, no written record, only instinct, only the knowledge carried in scars across my knuckles, in the memory of 1,000 basements. Hours passed, unnoticed. Sweat soaked through my shirt, and the night chilled it into my skin. Dust clung to my hair, my lungs burned, but I kept moving, kept listening, until the building sighed. That was the moment I always waited for, the exhale, the release, the quiet gratitude that no one else believed a building could give. The walls settled, the cracks stilled, and the silence became calm again. The danger had passed. The collapse had been stopped. When I finally set down my wrench, the sky was already pale with dawn. I gathered my tools and looked back one last time. The wall still bore its scar, but the life within had steadied. They would arrive soon, the professors and students, and they would find the structure still standing. They would shake their heads in wonder, puzzled at how a building on the brink of failure had righted itself overnight. They would write reports, form committees, invent explanations, but they would never know the truth, that a man they had dismissed had come in the dark, without payment, without recognition, to save what they could not. I left quietly, my footsteps fading into the morning mist. No signature, no witness, no applause. Only the quiet knowledge that I had once again kept their world from crumbling. But as I walked away, a heaviness settled in my chest. I had saved them, yes, but I had also preserved their blindness. By fixing their mistakes in secret, I had ensured that they would go on, never knowing my name. And the question I carried with me into the dawn was heavier than my tools. How many times could I give them salvation before it broke me completely? It happened quietly, as all the most important things in my life seemed to happen. Not with applause, not with recognition, but with a single pair of eyes that lingered too long. I thought I was alone that evening, sweeping dust from the corners of the lecture hall, my tools heavy at my side. I had paused to rest, unfolding one of the sketches I carried in my pocket, smoothing the creases with my calloused hand. Just a scrap, nothing polished. A vision of a library, where the ceiling bent like a wave of light. I traced the lines absently, as I always did, letting the dream breathe for a moment before tucking it back into the shadows. When I looked up, I saw him. A student, thin, with a notebook clutched to his chest, standing in the doorway he wasn't supposed to be in. His eyes were not filled with the casual dismissal I had grown used to. They were wide, searching, hungry, the way only the young look at something they've never considered possible before. He had seen the sketch. Worse, he had seen me holding it as though it belonged to me. I expected the smirk, the easy laughter, the cruel repetition of words I had heard my whole life. You're just a plumber. But none came. He stepped closer, slow, almost reverent, as if afraid I might tear the paper before he reached me. His gaze moved not only to the drawing, but to the way I stood in the room, the way my hands hovered near the walls, my eyes fixed on the lines of the ceiling, as though I were not a laborer at all, but a man measuring space with something deeper than tape and numbers. "You move differently," he said, finally. Just that. And though the words were simple, they struck through me. He had seen what no one else had ever cared to see. I didn't move like a worker patching mistakes. I moved like someone who had dreamed the building before it stood, like someone tracing the heartbeat beneath the concrete. I could have denied it. I could have laughed, brushed it away, shoved the sketch back into my pocket. Years of mockery had trained me to hide, to bury anything that hinted at a world beyond my assigned role. But his eyes stopped me. They were not the eyes of a judge or a skeptic. They were the eyes of a witness. In that moment, the basement, the laughter, the dismissal of my own son, all of it felt less suffocating, because if even one person saw the truth, then perhaps it was not madness. Perhaps the buildings had been whispering to me for a reason. Perhaps the drawings in my drawer were not only ghosts, but seeds waiting for light. I said nothing to him. Words felt too fragile. I only folded the sketch carefully and slid it back into my pocket. He nodded as though he understood, and left as quietly as he had appeared. But long after he was gone, I remained standing in the half-light, my heart pounding with something I had not felt in years. Not pride, not hope exactly, but recognition, the faintest echo of being seen. And though I told no one, though I went back to silence and shadows, I carried that moment with me. For the first time in my life, I was not entirely invisible. Someone had witnessed me, and sometimes a witness is the first crack in the wall of silence that surrounds a man. The years passed, and with them my body bent lower, my hair grayed, my hands stiffened from decades of gripping cold iron and turning bolts in the dark. I had stopped waiting for recognition. Silence had become the rhythm of my life. I fixed what broke. I drew in secret. I hid the sketches beneath tools no one wanted to touch. The world had already decided what I was, and I had grown tired of fighting shadows. Then, one morning, long after I thought such things could no longer happen to me, a letter arrived. The envelope bore the crest of the architecture school, the very place where I had once sat in the back row, invisible, listening to my own knowledge spoken in someone else's voice. My first thought was that it must be a mistake, some clerical error, a bill perhaps. But inside was a note, written in a hand that trembled slightly even through the ink. "You may not remember me, but I remember you. You were my first teacher." His name stirred faintly in my memory, the thin student who had once stood in a doorway, notebook clutched to his chest, eyes wide as he watched me trace invisible lines in the air. He had seen what no one else dared to see. And now, years later, he was no longer a student but a professor, returning with words I had never expected to hear. He wrote that he had built his career on lessons I had given without knowing, lessons in how buildings breathe, how they carry their weight in silence, how a man must listen before he dares to design. He wrote that no textbook had taught him those things, only the way I had moved through space, the way I had treated pipes not as metal but as veins. The letter ended with an invitation. Come and speak to the students, not as a worker, not as a repairman, but as the man who had taught him what architecture truly meant. He wished to name the lecture after me, so that the next generation would know the source of the knowledge they carried forward. I read the letter again and again, the words blurring as tears filled my eyes. I had been called many things in my life, plumber, fixer, laborer, but never teacher, never architect. And now here it was in ink, in the handwriting of a man who owed me nothing, yet had given me more than I had ever received from my own blood. I thought of my son and his smirk, of the professors who erased my words, of the endless nights in basements where the world forgot me. All of it rose like a tide, pressing against my chest, and for the first time in years I felt the weight begin to lift. One person had remembered. One person had carried my invisible work into the light. I folded the letter carefully, as if it were one of my old sketches, and held it against my heart. It did not erase the years of silence. It did not undo the laughter or the shadows, but it was a door opening after a lifetime of being locked out. And as I stood there in my small kitchen, surrounded by the quiet hum of pipes in the walls, I realized that perhaps justice does not always arrive with thunder. Sometimes it arrives softly, in a letter, carried by a former student who whispers back to you the truth you thought the world had buried forever. The letter had been a flame in the dark, and for a time I carried it like a lantern inside my chest. But word spreads quickly in halls lined with pride, and soon the flame met a storm. When the young professor proposed naming a lecture after me, the faculty did not meet his idea with curiosity or respect. They met it with laughter, the same kind I had heard my entire life, echoing in different mouths but carrying the same weight of dismissal. "He's a plumber," one of them said. "What business does he have in an architecture school?" Another scoffed. "Do we name our lectures after janitors, too?" The words, sharp and polished with arrogance, traveled down corridors and found their way back to me like barbs. They didn't need to know me. The label alone was enough. In their eyes, a life bent over pipes was proof of limits, not of wisdom. They refused to believe that knowledge could rise from basements, that truth could be born from sweat and silence, rather than textbooks and degrees. I heard their resistance in fragments, rumors whispered by those who pitied me, warnings carried by the very professor who had invited me. "They don't understand," he told me, sorrow in his voice. "They see you only as they've been taught to see. To them, you'll never be more than a laborer." The words hit me like hammer blows against brittle copper. I had lived my life under that sound. Clang, 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 the music of dismissal, ringing hollow but loud enough to drown out the quiet pulse of truth. And still, hearing it again after all these years cut deeper than I expected. Perhaps because I had dared to hope. Perhaps because the letter had cracked something open in me, something fragile I had kept buried. At night I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, imagining their voices in the faculty chamber. I saw their polished shoes tapping impatiently, their hands adjusting ties, their mouths curling in disdain. They had the power to close the door again, to slam it so tightly that no invitation could ever slip through. And I felt the old fear return, that perhaps I was a fool for believing one man's recognition could outweigh a lifetime of silence. But then I remembered the student who had once stood in the doorway, notebook clutched to his chest, eyes wide as he called me different. I remembered the building that sighed in relief when I saved it in the night. I remembered the lines I had drawn on scraps of paper, hidden under steel, lines that no ridicule had ever managed to erase. And I understood something. Their resistance was not proof of my unworthiness. It was proof of their blindness. Still, the hurt was real. Each word of theirs rang inside me, heavy and hollow, like someone pounding against an old pipe, trying to break what had already survived decades underground. They thought they could silence me with volume, but I had lived in silence my whole life, and silence had made me strong. So I waited, not with anger, not with bitterness, but with the steady patience of water pressing against stone. Because water always finds its way. And so would I. The drawer had sat untouched for years, buried beneath the weight of tools and silence. Its handle was worn smooth by my fingers, though I had long stopped pulling it open. Each time I passed it, I felt the temptation, but also the sting of memory, my son's smirk, the clang of the drawer shutting on dreams I was told would never matter. But that night, after hearing how the faculty mocked me once again, I knew I could not remain invisible. If they wanted proof of who I was, if they demanded to see more than a laborer bent over pipes, then I would give it to them. Not words, not arguments, lines. My hands trembled as I slid the drawer open. The air smelled faintly of oil and old paper, a scent that carried decades of secrets. Inside lay the stack of sketches, curled at the edges, stained by grease, some smudged with fingerprints from nights when exhaustion blurred my sight. They were not polished, they were not perfect, but they were alive. I lifted the first sheet gently, as though it were fragile skin, and looked at a design I had drawn half a lifetime ago, a library whose walls bent like open arms, meant to hold light as tenderly as it held books. I saw the chapel with curves shaped by dawn, the museum that spiraled like a shell pulled from the sea. I had forgotten some of these lines, but the moment my eyes traced them, the breath returned. When I brought them to the table, the professors laughed first. Their polished suits, their clipped voices, their confidence. They looked at the stains on the pages and saw only filth. "Old papers," one said. "Scraps." But then the young professor, the one who had invited me, spread them wider. He asked them to look closer. And slowly, one by one, their expressions shifted, because, despite the stains, the lines carried something their own projects had never held. They were not sterile or mechanical. They moved. They carried rhythm, weight, breath. The arches bent like living things. The halls seemed to open into eternity. My drawings were not the work of theory. They were the work of listening. Listening to pipes, to walls, to water, to silence. And though they could deny me titles, they could not deny the life those sketches radiated. I stood quietly at the back of the room, as I always had, letting them murmur, letting their eyes flicker over the pages they had never expected to see. In my chest, my heart pounded, not with pride, but with a strange ache, a mixture of vindication and sorrow. Vindication, because I had given them the proof they demanded. Sorrow, because I had carried it all these years, hidden and unseen, while they praised lesser visions in the open. The silence that filled the room when the last page was lifted was unlike any silence I had ever known. It was not dismissal. It was not ridicule. It was the silence of recognition, the moment when even arrogance cannot find words. And though they did not say it yet, though resistance still lingered in their faces, I knew something had shifted. My sketches, yellowed and smudged as they were, had spoken louder than their titles. For the first time, the proof of my life's work lay not in pipes hidden behind walls, but in lines drawn into the open. And no one could pretend they hadn't seen. The room was heavy with the weight of paper and silence. My sketches lay across the long oak table, their edges curled, their surfaces scarred with oil stains and fingerprints. They looked so small against the polished wood, like orphans brought into a world too refined to claim them. The faculty sat stiff in their chairs, their eyes shifting but their mouths closed, as though words might betray them. For years they had spoken with such confidence, dismissing me with the ease of a shrug. But now, confronted with the living breath inside those lines, they had nothing. I stood at the edge of the room, the same position I had occupied my whole life, watching, waiting, unseen. My heart pounded like a hammer in the quiet, but I did not move. This was not a fight I could win with arguments. I had given them proof, and proof has its own voice. Still, the silence gnawed at me, threatening to turn those drawings once more into forgotten scraps. Then, from the far end of the table, a voice rose. Not loud, not commanding, but steady. The young professor, the student who had once seen me with clear eyes, leaned forward. His hand rested gently on one of the sketches, the one of the library with walls like open arms. He spoke, almost in a whisper, but the room bent toward him to hear. This is architecture, real architecture. The words did not thunder, yet they landed with a force that shook me. My throat tightened, my chest ached, because no one had ever said it aloud before. To the world I had been a laborer, a fixer, a shadow. But now, in this room where I had once been invisible, my work had been named. Not repair, not accident, architecture. Some of the faculty shifted uncomfortably. Their pride bristled, their faces hardened. I could see the resistance still alive in them, but it was weaker now, fractured. Because once truth is spoken, it cannot be unsaid. The young professor continued, his voice still calm but firmer now, carrying the weight of someone who knew he was risking more than reputation. He spoke of the nights he had watched me work, the way I moved through space as though listening to its breath. He told them I had been his first teacher, though no syllabus had listed my name. He said that what lay on the table was not scraps, it was the foundation of thought that had shaped him, and through him every student he had taught since. The silence deepened, but this time it was different. It was not the silence of dismissal. It was the silence of walls crumbling, of certainty breaking. One of the older professors cleared his throat, muttered something about unconventional sources. Another nodded stiffly, unwilling to concede, but unable to deny. The tide was shifting, quietly, almost imperceptibly, but it was shifting all the same. Then came the moment I had never dreamed would arrive. A clerk at the side of the room, who had been recording the session, asked for the official name to enter into the protocol, and for the first time in my life, when he wrote it down, it was not followed by plumber or maintenance or repairman. It was entered simply as mine, my name, no label, no dismissal, just the mark of a creator. I stood frozen, my hands trembling at my sides. It was such a small act, ink on paper, but to me it was heavier than any stone I had ever lifted. Decades of silence, of laughter, of invisibility had been pierced by a single line of acknowledgement. My name had been spoken in truth. And in that moment, I realized justice does not always roar. Sometimes it arrives as a whisper in a quiet room, where one brave voice dares to say what others will not. Sometimes it is nothing more than ink drying on a page. But to the man who has waited his whole life, it is everything. The hall was overflowing that morning. Rows upon rows of students filled every seat, and still more stood in the aisles, notebooks pressed against their chests, eyes wide with expectation. I had never seen so many gathered for a single lecture, and certainly never for one bearing my name. My heart hammered as I stood behind the curtain, calloused hands damp, my body heavy with the weight of years spent unseen. I had fixed leaks in silence, saved collapsing walls in darkness, drawn cathedrals in secret, but I had never stood before a crowd that wanted to listen. When they called me forward, the sound of applause rose, but I hardly heard it. My steps felt unsteady, as though the ground beneath me might crack if I leaned too hard on the moment. The podium loomed, polished and cold, a thing I had never touched in my life. For a moment I almost faltered. I almost believed the voices of the past, the laughter of professors, the smirk of my son, the echo of "you're just a plumber." But then I looked out into the sea of faces, and I saw the young professor, the student who had once been my witness, standing at the edge of the stage. He nodded, not with ceremony, but with the quiet assurance of someone who knew the truth. I began to speak. Not with the precision of formulas, not with the authority of books, but with the cadence of a man who has lived what he knows. I told them that a building is not just walls and beams, not just weight and angles. A building breathes. It carries water like blood, it exhales through vents, it groans and sighs with age. And if you cannot hear it, if you cannot lean close enough to catch the heartbeat of a pipe, the whisper of air moving through its lungs, then you are not building anything alive. You are only stacking bricks. The room was utterly still. Students leaned forward, pencils frozen in their hands, as though afraid that scribbling notes might disturb the truth hanging in the air. I spoke of nights spent in basements, of listening to walls before deciding where to cut, of how silence teaches more than theory if only you dare to listen. I told them that architecture is not domination of space, but conversation with it, that every pipe, every line, every hidden joint carries dignity, and that the truest designs are the ones that honor what already lives inside a structure. I had expected doubt, perhaps even laughter. But what I saw instead were eyes lit with something I recognized, the spark of recognition, the hunger for more than formulas, the yearning to believe that their work could be more than calculations on paper. They were not listening to a repairman. They were not listening to a ghost from the basements. They were listening to someone who had lived inside the bones of buildings, someone who spoke not of structures, but of souls. When I finished, silence lingered for a long breath before the applause came. It was not the perfunctory sound of courtesy. It was thunder, rolling through the hall, striking against my chest until I could hardly breathe. I gripped the podium to steady myself, not from fear this time, but from the overwhelming weight of finally being heard. For the first time in my life, I stood not in the back row, not beneath the floorboards, not in the shadows of someone else's design. I stood at the center, and they listened. They listened to me. And as I stepped down from the stage, I felt something deeper than pride. I felt belonging, not to the institution, not to the faculty, not even to the craft of architecture as they had defined it, but to the truth itself, that a man dismissed as just a plumber had spoken of life, and the world had finally recognized it as architecture. The day it happened, the campus was bright with spring. Flowers had pushed their way through the soil, trees heavy with blossoms swayed against the clean air, and the chatter of students spilled through the courtyards like music. I walked slowly, my body carrying the stiffness of years, my hands marked with lines that no soap could wash away. I had not planned to come. I had heard whispers, but after a lifetime of disappointment, I no longer trusted whispers. And yet something drew me there, something quiet and insistent, like the pull of water toward its source. The building rose ahead of me, the same hall where I had once sat in the shadows, invisible. I remembered every detail, the polished seats I was never meant to fill, the diagrams stolen and renamed, the applause that belonged to others. For so many years I had walked past those doors as a ghost, carrying the knowledge that my work lived inside, but my name never would. But that morning, as the sun slanted across the glass, I saw it. A plaque. New gleaming, fastened firmly to the wood beside the lecture hall door. I moved closer, each step heavier, until the letters sharpened into focus. My name. Not hidden in ink on forgotten sketches, not whispered in basements, not spoken quietly by a lone student. No, engraved, permanent, announcing to every passerby that this hall carried not just lessons, but a legacy. The lecture in the name of, and then me. I reached out a trembling hand and touched the cold brass. For a long moment, I could not breathe. All the years of ridicule, of invisibility, of laughter pressed against my chest at once. And then, slowly, they began to break. My son's smirk, the professor's sneers, the endless repetition of just a plumber, they faded like echoes swallowed by the wind. What remained was silence, but not the silence of dismissal. This was the silence of truth settling into its place, immovable. Students passed by, their eyes catching the plaque. Some read it aloud, casually, unaware of what it meant to the man standing before it. They did not know the decades of shadows behind those letters, the basements, the drawings hidden under tools, the wounds carried in silence. But their voices gave life to the inscription. Every time one of them spoke my name, even without knowing, it carved deeper into the world the fact that I had been here, that I had built something no one could erase. I stood there until the courtyard emptied, until the sun tilted westward and the light caught the plaque like fire. And in that glow I understood. Justice had arrived not in applause, not in parades, not in the roar of recognition. Justice had arrived in brass and stillness, in the quiet permanence of a name no longer denied. I had lived my life carrying buildings on my back, holding walls from collapsing, saving others in silence. I had been mocked, overlooked, reduced. But here, now, the world had spoken back. It had left me a mark that would outlive me. Long after my hands could no longer lift a wrench, long after my voice had gone still, students would walk through that door and see it, my name, not as just a repairman, not as only a fixer, but as a creator, as a teacher, as a man who had listened to the heartbeat of buildings when no one else cared. I turned to leave. The weight inside me changed. Not gone, but transformed, heavier and lighter all at once. Heavier because I now carried the full measure of my journey. Lighter because the burden of invisibility had finally been lifted. And as I stepped away, I knew I did not need to look back again. The plaque would remain, holding my place long after my footsteps faded. It was not victory in the way the world usually tells it. It was not loud, not celebrated with banners or speeches, but it was real. It was justice in a name, etched into brass, anchored into the wall of the very place that had once erased me. And that kind of justice does not vanish. It stays. Forever.